Chinese reforming politician Hu Yaobang, who had been forced from office in 1987 for being too lenient on student protesters, died suddenly of a heart attack in April. He was quickly adopted as a martyr to the cause of democracy by students who began to gather around the monument to the people's heroes in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, as well as in other cities around the country. A couple of days later, a mass march of thousands of students took place in Beijing, and the gathering at Tiananmen Square began to become an organised protest. Before long, groups from Shanghai, Nanjing and Xi'an were also travelling to Beijing to join what had become an enormous sit-in protest. And before long, over 1 million protesters had marched through Beijing, demanding greater democracy. In Europe, meanwhile, things also seemed to be changing. The Soviet Union, as part of its drive to modernise and revitalise its economy, issued its first Visa card and began construction on the first McDonald's restaurant in the country. The relatively liberal Hungarian government, meanwhile, ordered the dismantling of the 240-kilometre, 149-mile electric fence along the border with neutral Austria. In the US, Colonel Oliver North was convicted of 3 charges of the 15 on which he had been indicted relating to the Iran-Contra affair, accepting an illegal gratuity, aiding and abetting the obstruction of a constitutional inquiry, and ordering the destruction of documents. Panama held its presidential election on Grand Prix Day. Since the early 80s, the small but strategically vital country had been effectively ruled by General Manuel Noriega, though he preferred to remain behind the scenes and avoid scrutiny, keeping good relations with the US government by assisting the anti-communist Contra rebels in neighbouring Nicaragua. But later in the decade, the Americans had begun to suspect that Noriega was playing both sides and also selling intelligence to Cuba. The election of 1989 was marked by fraud and violence as the Noriega-backed PRD party tried to ensure the election of its candidate Carlos Duque, but in the end, the opposition candidate Guillermo Endara won comfortably. Noriega refused to accept the defeat of his candidate, but when Duque refused to be installed as president anyway, knowing he'd lost, the US recognised Endara as the new president, but he and some other opposition leaders were confronted by Noriega's paramilitaries on the street as they celebrated victory and badly beaten. A world away from Central American political violence, the streets of Monaco once more rang with the sound of high-powered engines as 38 cars tried to squeeze around faster than the others. Just 38 because Gerhard Berger was missing, still recovering from his Imola crash, but present at Monaco looking surprisingly fit and hoping to be back in the cockpit soon. News about Philippe Streff was less good, however, as it was revealed the talented Frenchman had been paralysed from the waist down by his accident in Brazil and would be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Given the usually cramped pit lane conditions, the Monaco organisers elected not to offer an additional pre-qualifying slot because of Berger's absence, as had been the case in Brazil, so again there would be just 4 cars making it through the early session on Thursday morning. Lotus had been doing some testing after a disappointing first couple of races, and both Team and Piquet pronounced themselves very happy with the car, though Piquet and Nakajima were also both on record as thoroughly disliking Monaco. After a disappointing Imola of their own, March had their new GC891 chassis available in the Principality for the first time, along with news that Akira Akagi, owner of chief sponsor Leighton House, was now the outright owner of the team, which would at least assure their funding for the future. And McLaren, not satisfied with their 1-2 in Imola, had done another 7-day test between races, adjusting the brake calipers and suspension geometry, and found another 3 kilos of weight savings on the engine. But what everyone really wanted to know was what was going on with the drivers, and through a series of cryptic statements, a picture was beginning to emerge. It seemed that, at Senna's suggestion, the two had agreed before the race that whoever made it into the first corner in the lead would not be challenged in the early stages to avoid a potential coming together. But the restart had complicated matters. Senna believed that the second start was a continuation of the first, and so, as he'd been in the lead of that, Prost should have deferred to him. Prost, on the other hand, interpreted it as a new start, the lead fair game once again, so he was upset when Ayrton took the lead back off him. Both felt that the other one had reneged on their deal. Ron Dennis had put the two of them in a room at Pembrey during testing the following week, and made Senna apologise to Prost and was telling the press at Monaco that that was the end of it as far as he was concerned. Quote, "At McLaren we like to have fun and enjoy our racing," said Ron, which was news to quite a lot of the press. Thursday morning saw Stefano Modena top the PQ charts once again, though a cold-ridden Brundle in the spare Brabham could only manage 4th, a scant couple of tenths ahead of Ghinzani. Between these two were Alex Caffey and Pierre-Henri Raffanel making it through to the qualifying for the first time. Raffinel's fellow Monaco first-timers Gasho, Wojtek, Weidler, Suzuki and Winkelhock were all propping up the table. The Senna-Prost rivalry now took to the track as Prost led in free practice, but Senna pulled out some stonking laps in qualifying proper, eventually getting the clear lap he needed on Saturday to do a record 1 minute 22.3 second lap, over 90 miles an hour on average, which is an insane feat on the narrow streets of Monaco. He was over a second ahead of Prost, with Boutsen almost another second behind in third. But fourth place was an absolute turn-up for the books, Martin Brundle in the Brabham, beating his illustrious compatriot Mansell by just under 2/10 after the Ferrari had suffered rear suspension failure and a front wing breakage, both at Casino Square in different sessions. Derek Warwick, a Monaco lover who now also has a car he really enjoys, was 6th, with Patrese 7th in the second Williams. Modena in the other Brabham was 8th, ahead of the two Delaras of Cafe and De Cesaris on row 5, with Martini equalling his and Minardi's best ever qualifying from Imola, 11th again. Alboreto was 12th in the new Tirolo 18, with Tarquini looking good in the AGS 13th. Monaco isn't necessarily the best place to introduce a new car, as March found out, with Gugelmin 14th and Capelli 22nd, while Benetton's old car was also proving problematic, as it seemed it didn't suit the new version of the Goodyear tyres, and Nannini and Herbert could only manage 15th and 24th respectively. Raffinel was an excellent 18th, his first Grand Prix start, ahead of Piquet and his own teammate Moreno, with both Colonis making it onto the grid, as did Arnoux for the first time this season. Palmer, still in the old Tyrrell, was 23rd, Sala brought up the rear, and Nakajima was slowest of all, joining Dana and Dalmas on the sidelines for race day. So once again the teams lined up, an hour later than usual to allow Prince Rainier to have his lunch, with Senna hoping to avenge his error last year which put him in the barrier when leading. The first start was waved off when Patrese stalled his engine and had to go around and start from the back, while Gugelmin's gearbox also broke and he'd have to start in the old 881 car from the pit lane. But after a short interval they were all ready to go again, and 26 cars thundered towards the tight Saint-Devote corner. Senna led the field through without incident, chased by Prost, Boutsen and Mansell, who'd got ahead of Brundle, then Warwick, De Cesaris, Modena, Martini, Tarquini and Cafe. By the end of the first lap everyone was still close together, with Senna slightly ahead and Prost being harried by Boutsen, while Patrese was carving his way back up through the field. Slowly, though, the McLarens began to pull away from Boutsen, while Brundle, with a camera mounted to his BT58, was hanging doggedly onto the back of Mansell's Ferrari. By lap 5, the gap from Prost to Boutsen was about 5 seconds as the two McLarens remained very close together. By then, there had already been 3 retirements, Warwick with electrical problems, Martini with a clutch failure, and Guiar with a dud gearbox. Speaking of gearboxes, Prost was right on Senna's, giving the Brazilian no rest at all and hoping to push him into making another mistake. While the cameras were understandably watching this, Mansell had shaken Brundle off and was gunning for Boutsen, but the Brabham wasn't being left behind, while De Cesaris had benefited from Warwick's misfortune to move up into the points and he was driving well. Boutsen got his foot down and started catching the McLarens again, as Brundle's camera broadcast some fantastic footage of the circuit where he'd come a spectacular cropper a few years earlier. By lap 10, the top 5 were now covered by just under 4 seconds, with another 5 back to De Cesaris in 6th. A few laps later, Brundle was back on Mansell's rear wing as the pairs started lapping back markers, and Senna was still flying, setting consecutive fastest laps, having, as usual, got a bit of a lead over Prost in the traffic. Boutsen dived into the pits to get a new rear wing fitted to promote the Mansell-Brundle scrap, 2-1 for the podium, and Senna continued to breeze through the traffic as if it wasn't there, while Prost took more time over it, and Raffinel's debut ended with a gearbox failure after 20 laps. Prost will freely admit that he's not the most incisive in traffic, but he had particular problems with his old teammate and rival René Arnoux in the Ligier, who was not only reluctant to move over and let Alain through, but seemed to be actively blocking him, earning the scorn of former champion James Hunt on the BBC commentary.
René Arnoux, who says, the reason I'm going so slow these days is that I'm used to turbo cars, and these normally aspirated engine cars are a very different kettle of fish to drive, he says.
And all I can say to that is bullshit.
James was never one to mince his words. By the time Alain finally got past, Senna's lead was nearly 15 seconds. But if anyone thought Arnoux had a chip on his shoulder about Prost specifically, they had to think again, as René, the oldest man on the track, now began to actively block Mansell as he tried to lap the Ligier in turn. Nigel forced his way through at Mirabeau like Prost, with Brundle elbowing him aside at the Lowe's hairpin as Piquet took advantage of Arnoux running wide to take the place off him too. All of which meant that De Cesaris had caught up to Brundle as well, with Modena in the second Brabham right on his tail, and he was next passed while the director showed some random wide shots of the course for some reason, instead of Martin Brundle overtaking Mansell for third. It soon became clear that Nigel was in trouble, and he parked up on lap 31 with a semi-automatic gearbox full of neutrals. Promoted therefore to fifth, meanwhile, Andrea De Cesaris was enjoying the unusual sensation of lapping other cars, and next on his list was three-time world champion Nelson Piquet, who wasn't exactly covering himself in glory at his least favourite circuit on the calendar. One journalist later described him as looking like a tourist driving around looking for a place to park. De Cesaris went inside at Lowe's hairpin, there was contact, and both cars ground to a halt right in the middle of the road, forcing other cars to slow to a crawl to go round them. By the time Prost arrived, there was a bit of a queue, and he actually had to come to a complete halt. By the time he got going again, Senna was long gone. As De Cesaris headed in for repairs and Piquet's car was craned off, Senna was in trouble. Unknown to Prost, he'd lost first gear a while back, which was not ideal at Monaco, but now he'd lost second too, and although he had a big lead, there was still half the race to go. With both Ferraris missing, both Williamses making their way back up after repair stops, and both Benettons struggling with their tyres, the running order had a different look to it. Behind Senna and Prost came the Brabhams of Brundle and Modena, then Tarquini's AGS, Caffi in the other Dallara 6th, Alboreto 7th in the Tyrrell, ahead of Nannini 8th, as Herbert came in from 13th for repairs after having his own run-in with René Arnoux while trying to lap him. Cheever had been running 10th in the remaining Arrows before skidding to a halt at Lowe's, but he was pushed on his way just as Gugelmin's old March retired with a seized-up Judd engine. By lap 40 of the 77, Senna led Prost by 35 seconds, with Brundle another 14 behind the number 2 McLaren, and absolutely flying round Monaco, reminding everyone that he used to beat Senna in equal cars back in their F3 days. Modena was another 20 seconds behind his teammate, and the McLarens and Brabhams were the only 4 on the lead lap. If Prost had known that Senna had gear problems, he might have put his foot down and pushed, but Ayrton was able to adjust his driving style, shaving the barriers and sliding through corners in a mesmerising display, convincing Prost that not only was there nothing wrong with Ayrton's car, but that he was on top of his game, and the Frenchman might as well just cruise to a safe second place. Brundle, though, was lapping faster than both of them, thoroughly enjoying himself and scenting a glorious comeback. Moreno's gearbox cried enough on lap 45, joining his teammate Raffanel in retirement, and a couple of laps later Tarquini's electrics went when he was running comfortably in the points. His bad fortune, though, was good for Caffi, who moved up to 5th, and Alboreto into 6th. And then Brundle's race fell apart, peeling into the pits and climbing out of the car while the team replaced his battery. He got back in and got going again 10th, but was now 2 laps down, and it was Modena in 3rd place as Salas Minardi expired in a cloud of steam. So Senna now led Prost, Modena, Caffi, Alboreto and Capelli, good day for Italy so far, and caught up to the number 8 Brabham to lap him on lap 59, as he was held up by that man again, Arnoux, who moved out of his way, much to everyone's surprise, and before long Modena was lapping Boutsen, who was trying in turn to unlap himself from Caffi. Stefano had spent 1988 mostly running at the back when he qualified at all, so this was a pleasant change for him, lapping a Williams. Arnoux was still proving a hazard, nearly taking out Cheever before blocking De Cesaris for a few corners, and soon enough a charging Brundle on new Pirellis was the one being stymied, but not for long. He got past off camera and set off in pursuit of De Cesaris and Cheever as Senna entered the last 10 laps of the race, still not showing any outward sign that he was missing 2 rather important gears. De Cesaris was evidently determined to make up for blotting his copybook early and was driving really well, unlapping himself from 7th place Cheever as Brundle hove into view behind them. As the camera switched to show Senna cruising on his majestic way to win number 16, Martin got past both of them, and when Capelli's engine blew on the very last lap, Martin swept gratefully past to take the last point. Scant reward for his fine race, but a welcome one nonetheless. Senna crossed the line to take the win, with Prost just under a minute behind, and Stefano Modena 3rd, taking his first F1 points in considerable style. Alex Caffi likewise took his first and the first for Scuderia Italia in 4th place. Alboreto took his first Tyrrell points, second time around, in 5th, and Brundle his first since Imola 1987. Cheever finished just outside the points in 7th, not bad from 20th on the grid, and an impressive 15 cars, over half the starting grid, had finished the race, which is not necessarily a given at Monaco. So Senna and Prost were now equal on points, with the Brazilian ahead on race wins, with Mansell still third despite not having scored in the last 2 races. McLaren dominance seemed to have been well and truly restored, as the team recorded their second 1-2 finish in 3 races to go 27 points clear at the top of the table, with Ferrari and Benetton both failing to trouble the scorers at Monaco, and Brabham now moving up into 4th, courtesy of their fantastic race. There were now 3 weeks to go until the next race, the first of a 3-stop tour of North America, beginning in Mexico, then to the new circuit at Phoenix, Arizona, and finishing up at Montreal in mid-June. René Arnoux, meanwhile, was under something of a cloud, with journalists and fans around the world uniting in condemnation of his driving, and the Monaco organisers issuing a rather vague statement that they might consider excluding him from next year's event if he didn't buck his ideas up.